welcome back to Urban X-Files. My name is Keith, and today this video is all about the men in black, and I'm pretty confident that there will be very little people on this planet who've not heard of the infamous Men in Black. Now, I'm going to talk about people's encounters with the Men in Black. So if you've ever had an encounter with the Men in Black after possibly seeing a UFO, then please let me know. So this event takes us back to sometime between the late 70s and the early 80s, and there is a young woman who was just looking out of her window that was in a flat, and the flat that she lived was on a high-rise block of flats, and she was on one of the top floors. Now, as she was gazing out into the wonderful sights of the views that she had with being on a high floor, she spotted something strange in the blue sky. What she seen was a little triangle that had a rounded corner rather than it being pointed, and it looked like it was just hovering. It just hovered in a stationary position. Now, the lady thought that it looked the same shape as, say, the dairy cheese and the spreadable cheeses that you get in them type of triangles. And she called out to her boyfriend, who was sat watching the TV, and her boyfriend come along, and he also saw this triangular craft hovering. Now, he went back and found some old binoculars, and by the time her husband got back to the window, this triangular craft had disappeared. It was a little while after this strange event that she was gazing out of the window again, and this time her husband had left the binoculars by the window just in case. And shortly afterwards, she spotted something in the sky at a bit of a distance. So she got the binoculars and looked, but she noticed that there were not one, but three of these triangular shaped crafts flying in a row in the blue sky. Now, her husband wasn't in at the moment, and he'd gone out, and when he arrived back at the flat, he met his wife, who was eager to show, not his wife, his girlfriend, eager to show these strange things. Before he got back, she said that she had a funny turn, and she said that she started to feel like dizzy, and she felt like she was going to be sick, and the way she described it was like she was pregnant and she was having morning sickness. So when her boyfriend arrived back, he'd seen his girlfriend that had been in the bathroom vomiting, and he was like, "What's going on? Are you okay?" And she pointed over to the window, and he looked and seen that binoculars had been moved, and he was like, "Oh, is it back? Is it back?" And he runs over to the window and tries to locate the strange flying objects. And when he went back to his girlfriend, he said, like, "Let's get you up, let's get you in bed and try and like sleep this off." And that was it for them. That night, nothing more happened. There was no more incidents, no more nausea. It was just one of those funny turns. Back up when she was out of bed and stuff like that, she noticed that these binoculars had vanished. And they both searched their apartment high and low for these binoculars and couldn't find them anywhere. So they both felt like someone had been in their apartment and stolen things without them knowing. Now, after it, they had managed to find the box that they come in, that they were kept in. You know, like there's like a leather box to keep the lenses clean and whatnot. And these were the only things that were left in the box. Now, the following day, her boyfriend was on his way to work, and he was driving down the road when he'd actually had quite a bad car accident, and he was taken to hospital. Now, when he was taken into hospital, this is when something strange happened. As he was lying in his bed, he was restricted due to the broken leg he'd received in this car accident. And he had pins, and he also had a cast on his arm. Now, his girlfriend come in to visit him, and she seen that his bed was empty. And nobody could find out where he was, because he couldn't get up by himself and go and like take himself to the toilet. He couldn't go and get himself into a chair because he'd broken his leg and he had his arm in a cast, and he was in a lot of pain and obviously on some severe pain medication. And obviously none of the doctors or nurses had discharged this guy from hospital. The case of this vanishing guy started to worry his girlfriend because they could not find him on any department, in any ward, in any place like X-ray or wherever it was. He was just nowhere to be seen. 2 hours later, she was obviously very upset at her missing boyfriend. So after a search of the hospital and all the grounds, she made the way back to his room. And there, in the bed, was a boyfriend who was fast asleep. He had no explanation to say where he'd been. At first, she was very doubtful, thinking that you've gone somewhere, you must have done something, someone's taken you somewhere. And he was like, honestly, I've got no explanation as to where I've been. Now, the next part of the story is that she began to recall what had happened on that night when she had that morning sickness, where all of a sudden she was vomiting, because she was trying to retrace everything, because there was so much going on with seeing these things, the binoculars going missing, thinking someone was breaking into their flat without them knowing, and then their boyfriend being in a serious vehicle accident. Her mind was overloaded, which you can, understand. Now, the part that gets strange is this part. Now, after she'd seen these strange triangles floating around in the sky, she heard something to the left of her, and she turned and found that there was a large man who was dressed in a black suit, and she was naturally startled by this strange man being right next to her. Now, he had a low, deep voice that was no accent. There was no tone or anything that she could say where he was from. He turned around and said to the girl that say nothing about the incident where you witnessed 3 things in the sky. Because if you do, we will take you away and you will never be seen again. And the next minute, she like woke up from a daydream and thought, did I just dream that someone was in our apartment and come and spoke to me? Because that's all she was able to remember. So she thought, I wonder if it was this guy who'd stole our binoculars. But then again, how would he know what we were looking at? Was someone from another building watching us, watching out into the sky? Where did this guy come from? How did he get in? What happened? So her boyfriend slowly recovered and they come out of hospital, and I think they were more occupied with his recovery than they were over the binocular incident and the strange man. She didn't mention anything to her boyfriend through fear of worry, you know, like him being in hospital and then a strange man being in their flat and her not being safe. Then it was only many years later that she read about, or first heard about, the Men in Black. And I think it was the fact the Will Smith film Men in Black, that she clicked, something inside clicked. She wondered if this man that was dressed in black with a white shirt and had black Ray-Bans on, was in her apartment, had spoken to her, and then she'd fell asleep or something because she woke up and wondered if it was a dream. She started to connect these dots. So had the man who appeared in her living room been one of these infamous men in black? And then it made her think, was this accident that her boyfriend, now husband, was involved in, was that part of this strange thing that happened in their lives? Because they couldn't account for his disappearance. He couldn't remember how the accident happened, and there were moments in time that had been lost forever with no explanation. So that is this couple's first experience with Men in Black. Now, this is before the days of the internet, when you type some letters into Google and it'll bring up the suggested search, and it'll bring up, you type in Men in Black, it'll go straight to the films, it'll go to all the different accounts that people have had and various things. And the strange thing now in today's world, that UFOs are now beginning to be accepted as a possibility. Even the governments of the world's top countries are saying that they have things that they aren't able to explain. Now, I want to make it clear that I find it hard to believe that we are the only planet in the whole universe that has life on it. I think it's ignorant for us to think that in a vast amount of space and time, there is no other planet out there with life form, whether this be dinosaurs, lions, monsters, alien hybrids. I do not know. I do not know whether these aliens would be able to have advanced technology to travel light years and come visit us on Earth and various things. I am not able to say. I would like to think that there's a possibility that there is something else out there, because, I mean, we haven't even searched the bottoms of our oceans and seas. I know in the news, in your thing, or like the headlines of various places, they say that we've only ever explored 5% of our oceans. And that is a very good point. Even today, we are finding new species of insects and animals that we had no idea existed. We are also finding bones and remains of animals from hundreds, if not millions of years ago. So, it does sort of, when you start thinking things like outside the bigger picture, then you will understand that there is more to things than we know in this world. So the next story that involves the Men in Black is a following account, which features more strange things spotted in the sky. And this time it takes us to not the sky, but a USO, which is an underwater, unidentified submarinal object. USO. Again, this takes us back to the 1980s. There were a group of people who had been out partying, enjoying the nightlife, as a young person would. This time it was early hours in the morning when there was a gentleman by the name of Phil who had gone out for a few drinks, and he'd spent the earlier part of the evening in a swanky wine lodge full of yuppies back then, and he'd taken a lady friend out, and he went to a restaurant and had a nice meal, and he then went on to a club and partied away till early hours in the morning. Now, he said that as the early morning rolled on, there was a thick fog that had descended on his town. And back then, they didn't have the technology that they do now that enabled them to see in severe weather conditions. So, to prevent any accidental mishaps, all the local airports have been closed because of this fog. And any flights into this area had been diverted to other airports around that were safe to land. A dozen accidents that had happened on that early hours that morning around that area. There was car accidents, there were boat accidents where boats had been unable to see any oncoming ships or boats, regardless of their horns and stuff. So there was a lot of misfortune that happened on that time. Now, the guy was walking along the promenade, and he was just following the railings going along. He had spotted something that he couldn't quite make out in the fog, and as he was looking out at sea, he could see like a light, and he strained his eyes to try and focus on what this light was, because he thought, it's quite low, so it's not an aeroplane in the sky. I can't hear no sounds of a helicopter that was hovering. There was no distinguished noise that he could say, right, okay, well, the light's coming from a ship or whatever it is. And he heard a really loud splash in the water. This startled him because it was completely unexpected. What happened next was something that absolutely terrified Phil. What he witnessed was this light that was hovering had very quickly rose up, hovered a little more, and then slowly came down and hit the water. This is what caused that splash, that noise that startled Phil. And as he was staring out, thinking that maybe a ship had been knocked down. He was absolutely terrified. Now, he noticed a green, yellow object inside the water. And this object began to come towards the pier where he was sat as he was walking along the dockside. He could see this thing in the water moving fairly quickly towards him. He said it was like a disc shaped. The only way you could describe it was what is like in old bin lids where you used to lift them off and they were in a round circle. That's how he described it. But he said it was large. It had like a greeny yellow light that emitted from it. It still moved towards him in the water, and he could not explain what was happening. He thought that someone had put something in his drink and caused him to trip, and he was losing his mind. As he was staring at this disc that emitted this green yellow light, it stopped when it was like 20 feet away from him. And he couldn't take his eyes off it. They were fixed. He didn't want to move in case whatever it was had spotted him. He froze in fear. Now, what he described, what he seen next, was that this green coloured object began to spin in the water. As it spun, he could hear this like humming sound. It wasn't the sound of a motor of a boat or a diesel engine, which you'd expect. It was the sound of like an electric motor inside, which wasn't around then, like this buzz noise the kind of noise you would hear if you were in an electric car and you put your foot down and you hear that noise. It's not the noise of the engine, it's an electric car, so it's the electric motor. And he said that as he was staring into the water and this started to spin, he said there was like various parts of light coming from different sections of this disc, and it started to get faster and faster, and then it started to move away from where he was stood watching, and the motion created like waves in the water, but not waves where they'd splash down. It was like a circular motion, like a whirlpool that was beginning to form in the water. Now, he was partly limited to what was happening down to the visibility, and the next moment he'd taken a few steps back and he watched as this thing shot out of the water and straight up into the sky and hovered there. He said it felt like it was hovering for around 20 minutes, but he said time had frozen, so it could have been 2 minutes or 2 hours, because he was just that mesmerized. He was in a trance of some sort. So after this green light rose up into the sky, he noticed it had turned into a white colour and it was rotating. He said it was like the outside of it rotated, but the internal side, which was stayed still. So this disc thing moved around the body of this disc, and then it shot off into the night. And he said as it shot off into the sky, he heard a bang. It's now we know that that was a sonic boom that he'd heard and seen. So the next day he went home and was in disbelief and didn't know what to do, what to make of it. So he fell asleep. So the next day, after the fog had lifted and he'd had his sleep and recovered, he felt awful and he wondered if he'd had a dream. So he decided that he couldn't decide whether he dreamt this. So what he done, he got washed, got changed, and made a coffee, and then went to the area that was either in his dream or where he had experienced this disc. And as he was there, he then said, "Is this something I should report to the police? Or do you think the police will dismiss me as being a drunken fool who's imagining things?" So Phil was unsure what he wanted to do. It was only later on that he had picked up a local paper, and he was not the only person to have noticed this strange incident. There were people from all sides of where the river is. The river comes in, so you've got a city on one side and a city on the other side, and then a big river in between. The river runs out into the sea and is a very well-known port. So it was reported in the papers that UFO spotted by multiple people. He said that there was all kinds of various things that had happened after the UFO report in the local paper. There were other things that had sort of shut this story down, where they said that the Army and the Navy had been conducting tests on new vehicles and new you know what I mean, things around for the defense, the country's defense, and that's what it was. So he was then stuck between thinking it was the Army or the Navy coming in to do some like test like in Area 51, where they have these strange tests that go on and people say it's an alien base and whatnot. This is what was then become an issue. So after he took interest in it, and he went and found out who the people were that seen him and seen these things, and he tried to conduct his own investigation. He even went as far as Parliament, and he wrote in and asked if there had been any, he wanted the details of any experiments that were going on. And after this is when he done his investigations. It was a little while afterwards, and Phil was contacted by a man on the phone, and the man identified himself as a guy who was high up in the military. He was like an admiral, and he said that he was based at a building near the city, and that he had heard of Phil's encounter with this thing, this glowing thing, and he wasn't sure what to make of this phone call. As the Admiral had said, you must not repeat any more of your story to any newspapers, any family, any friends. This is a top secret military experiment. So you will be done for treason, for sharing military secrets, which is regarded as a very serious offence in this country. Now this terrified Phil, because he was completely taken back at being threatened by what he thought was a high up government gentleman who was part of the naval forces, being an admiral. And he said that if he does, he will be arrested and sentenced to a very, very long time in prison. And he made Phil promise and take an oath that he would not repeat this story. So after the phone call, Phil had put the phone down and he began and he sat and he was like absolutely terrified. And then he began to think, how did this person get my number? How did he know who I was? Why would the top officer in the Navy or the Air Force or whatever it is he was, why would he contact me? Wouldn't it be, surely he would have people underneath him who would do his, the things that I needed to do. And so he began to think there was something strange about this. So as the days began to go past, the weeks went past, and then months went past, he said that Phil and his family had started hearing strange noises on their telephone. Like, when they picked up the phone, it was like they could hear people very, very faintly, not all the time, but at times, when they dialed the number and they were listening. He said he could hear strange clicks, which is a sign of his phone being bugged. So this wasn't just in his own house, it was in Phil's family's houses too. And then, as the months went by, these things started to sort of like calm down. They were less frequent and they forgot about the bugs. They'd called out like British Telecom to come and check the lines, and they found all the lines were fine and there was nothing wrong. And what happened was just probably down to a crossed wire in part of the made connection to some other person's phone line. And he said that he was in his parents' house on this particular day. He said his parents were out at work and he heard a knock at the door. So he went to the door, answered the door, and he said there were two men dressed in black who presented a military ID badge to him. Now, he was unable to explain or identify where these voices had come from. Well, not where they come from, but he couldn't distinguish any of its accents or dialects. He said they were just like, they just spoke in a single monotone, dull voice that was quite hypnotic. And he said that when they questioned him, they asked to come in, and obviously Phil was startled, so he said no. And he said, we have been informed that you have spotted something strange. We need to talk to you about what you witnessed. And he said, I no longer discuss this. I don't know what happened. I was drunk. I can't remember, and sent them on his way. So that really frightened Phil. So as time went by, he moved back into his parents' house through fear that he was being watched, because he would see the same people wherever he went. If he was on the bus, there was someone who was there on the bus at the same time he was. He thought, okay, well, maybe this is just coincidence. Maybe they're going to work. Maybe they're, I don't know. So he changed the times of day that he travelled, he walked, took different routes. And whatever route he'd taken, he would see these same people. He thought it was just down to paranoia. And it wasn't until that it was like a year later, he was approached by a police car, and the police car put on their blues, flashed the lights, and gestured the gentleman to come towards the car. So the policeman asked Phil, what's your name, and have you ever been in trouble with the law? So Phil was taken back by this strange question and said to the policeman, "No, I've never been in trouble with the law, or, anything like that." And he didn't give them the name. So after speaking to the police, they said, "Phil, we need you to get into the back of the car." And Phil was very, very reluctant to do this, but as he was a law-abiding citizen, this was the police, so he didn't want to break the law, so he wasn't clued up on his rights and different things. So he reluctantly got into the back of the police car, and the police turned and started to question him. And they drove down various roads, and they were driving to no particular destination, because obviously Phil knew the road he was on, he knew where he was, what around the area. So where they were driving, there was no sort of oh yeah, you go this way to get to the city centre, you go that way to get to a school or whatnot. It was just random roads. And it was only after the questions had been asked and they were trying to catch him out with various techniques that they had, that is when Phil realised that these policemen he'd met before. These policemen were the same men who were dressed in black that he'd seen at the address of his parents. But their appearance had obviously changed, and it slowly dawned onto him that he'd voluntarily got into the back of a fake police vehicle with fake policemen. He was absolutely terrified. And at first he thought they were some kind of intelligence agents who'd been contacted by this head guy in the Admiral, he was called. So he thought it was part of them. And he said that the men's disguises looked very strange. They had that monotone voice, but it looked like they were wearing makeup, which he thought was very strange for a man. Both men who were police, supposedly, to wear sometime in the early 80s. And Phil had said, as he was coming to the lights, he said, "I want to get out the car now." So they looked at one another and sped off. And then they come to traffic. And he said, "I really need to leave." So he opened the door, and as he done so, one of them grabbed hold of him. And he says, "If you ever breathe a word about any of these experiences that you've come across over the past 2 years, believe us now, we will know. We will find out. And if you do so, we will be there. Except this time, you won't be getting out of the car. It will be the last words you ever speak. You will lose your parents, your family, all at the same time. So I suggest that you never speak of this incident again." So these fake policemen then let Phil go. As you can imagine, he ran from the car, and he was thoroughly shaken by these threats. He'd only reached the corner of a street that was about 40 yards away, and he turned round to see where the car was, because it was in a bit of traffic. The car was gone. He could not see where the car was. He was thinking, how has he turned around the corner? There's nowhere he could possibly go. The car had literally disappeared in a matter of seconds. And after that, it was the last time he discussed anything to do with aliens ever again. And it wasn't until many years later, when he'd heard no more of these strange men, the telephone click started, he'd moved on with his life, he'd had kids, he was married, so all this was like a distant memory. And it was only when he was listening to somebody else talk about Men in Black and their strange experiences that it caused him to listen in more, as he'd forgotten a lot of the stuff that had happened, and it terrified him when he recalled what had happened. It really shook him up. And there was another gentleman who had also experienced something very similar to Phil's story. Roger was another man who'd had a very similar experience. Now, Roger was not in the same location as Phil was. Roger was from a completely other different city, and Roger was a couple of years older than Phil. And he said it was literally like listening to his own story. So what was this thing he witnessed in the water? Who was these two people dressed in black, who pretended to be police officers, who pretended to be military enforcement people of some sort? Will we ever know? Who knows? Now, I would just like to add something to this story. Now, it doesn't involve these two gentlemen. It involves something else that is from another part of the world. It says that these were just potential strange things that had happened, and they were just coincidental. Obviously, we have to remain open-minded, and it wasn't until that this evidence had come forward that made Phil and Roger both realise that they wasn't going crazy. There was a ship called Naviero that had its crew on, and they were out at sea, and they witnessed a circular shaped craft that was over 80 feet in length, that had appeared from out of the water and cruised alongside the ship. It said this happened not far from a South American coast. The captain had come up onto the deck of the Naviero ship, and he saw the unidentified vehicle for himself. It had submerged back under the water, and it was right next to the ship. It glowed this green yellow glow, like a phosphorus glow, and he said that it was quite clearly there was no submarine on Earth that would be able to do what this glowing disc was doing. It is impossible for a ship to emerge from the water, to be level as the ship was moving, without any engine, without any loud noise, or it's like you could not have a jet engine in the water because it needs air to be sucked in. So it's impossible that this, don't forget, we're going back to the 80s, it was impossible for this to be achieved. He had no explanation from it whatsoever. So the captain had checked the sonar of the ship, and he could not find anything that was next to the ship, though he could visibly see this thing. And he said that the submarine then submerged underwater a little more and it moved forward out of sight. And then he witnessed this disc that was green and had a greeny yellow phosphorus glow shoot out of the water at about 100 feet in the air, where it changed from green and had this white bluish light to it, which shot off into the night sky. The captain was too scared to log this in his book, in the captain's log, through fear of losing his job, because you do not get people of senior authority who would report these strange things. But that he had witnesses, he had the whole ship's passengers, the crew on board, who'd also seen this thing. And there is no explanation. As of today, as far as I'm aware, there is no submarine that can submerge the water, that could rise from the water and then take off into the night sky without an engine, or what we would perceive as an engine. No, back in the 80s, there was no everything had to be powered by an engine or nuclear. This wasn't. They had no explanation for what this craft was, where it come from. Now, the captain had said he'd seen nothing like this in over 3 decades at sea. And like I said before, there is over 70% of this planet is covered in water, with the average depth of an ocean going past multiple miles. It is impossible, even in today's age of 2021, that we have any way of visiting the deepest parts of our oceans as easily as it is to drive your car down the road. Going back 300 years ago, you wouldn't have imagined that we'd be able to fly across the water to a whole other country. It just wouldn't have been imagined. So what was this vehicle that they witnessed? Who were these people who had stopped this person? Why come after Phil? Why come after Roger? What was the reason? And as of today, we have no explanation. I hope you enjoyed today's story. If I rambled on a bit, I do apologize. I have a habit of doing so. Take care and see you all in the next video. Peace.